For you. I certainly appreciated Jordan's message this morning. Wow, it was right on point. I wasn't going to share this with you, but in light of Jordan's message, I just thought you might find this very interesting. It's about one of my very favorite people, Jane Fonda. And just when I think it can't get any stranger, I found this little article. This is just from this week, from December 23rd. Jane says, I found myself backsliding a bit in terms of where my thought have tended to reside, not always with the generosity of vision I wish for, and my confidence has been iffy for the past 4 months, she said on her 77th birthday. So while meditating today, an idea came to me. I'm going to create a shrine to myself. Or at least the self I wish to be, the self who began to manifest when I was a young girl before it all hit the fan. The shrine will be a place filled with items that remind her of the qualities that represented her best self. So far, she has a school report card from the 4th grade. I don't know why I found that interesting. And I'll tell you, if I were to build a shrine to myself, I couldn't include the report card from the 4th grade. Couldn't do it. Something about behavior. In 1958, the Green Bay Packers had just finished the season with a record of 1-10-1. The next season, the owners hired a new coach, a young man named Vince Lombardi. In one of the early games of 1959, the team suffered a miserable defeat, and Lombardi addressed the team after the game with the now famous words, "Gentlemen, this is a football." He took the team back to basics, and they didn't do anything but work on blocking and tackling and a very simple playbook. They finished the season at 7-5, and Lombardi was named Coach of the Year. And over the next 8 years, Lombardi's Packers won 5 NFL championships, including the first 2 Super Bowls. Turn to the book of Ezra, if you will. Right after 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, then you have Ezra, right before Nehemiah, before Esther. If you get to Job and the Psalms, you've gone too far. Ezra chapter 1. Our next 4 lessons, including today, are going to be about, or actually more than that, are going to be Ezra and Nehemiah. I just want to give you a little background. I don't want to get too professorial about it, but I'm really fascinated by the background of Ezra and Nehemiah because in the Jewish literature, they're classified as one book. And even in the early translations of the Bible, Ezra/Nehemiah was divided into 2 parts, 1st and 2nd Ezra. So tradition had it that these were written by the same people. The language is just identical. They used the same terms. So it's likely it was penned by the same person. Tradition says that it was Ezra, who was a prophet and a scribe. There are a lot of naysayers out there, but nobody really has any evidence to deny it. And so I'm going to go with tradition in this case and say that it was likely penned as one work, Ezra and Nehemiah, by the prophet Ezra. I want to give you just a little bit of background, just kind of put a stick in the dirt here so you'll know where we're going in terms of timeline of history. The northern king of Israel fell to the Assyrians in 722 BC. Okay? The southern kingdom of Judah fell in 586 BC to Babylon, and they were carried off into captivity. In the meantime, Babylon was overrun by the Persians. So the Jews kind of found themselves handed off from captivity, from the Assyrians to the Babylonians to now the Persians. And our story will open in Ezra during that time, during the exile, when both Israel and Judah was off in exile. Now, there's something kind of interesting. I won't ask you to look at it right now, but if you look at, say, the first paragraph of Ezra, it is identical to the last paragraph of 2nd Chronicles. So if you just turn back a few pages to 2nd Chronicles, you'll see that the end of 2nd Chronicles is the beginning of Ezra. We don't know if that is a result of a copyist moving it. Likely, Ezra, it is thought that Ezra could well have been the person who wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles also. The language is very similar. But we do know that for emphasis, he repeated the end because it kind of sets the story for us, it sets it in context. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, let me stop right there. And you might find this interesting also, the Jewish word for Cyrus is Koresh. Koresh, like as in David Koresh, which is where he got that. But that's the Jewish term for Cyrus. So I will use the anglicized version and still say Cyrus, but just so you'll know, it's Koresh. He was the king of Persia. And in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and to put it in writing. Now, Ezra is tying things together here because there is indeed a prophecy 150 years before Cyrus was even born, mentioning Cyrus and his role in freeing the Israelites. Which is just another example that we give if people talk about fulfilled prophecy. This is one of them. Ezra is reminding of that. This is what Cyrus says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem and Judah. Any one of his people among you, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, to Judah, and build the temple of the Lord, the God of Israel, the God who is in Jerusalem, and the people of any place where survivors may now be living are to provide him with silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with freewill offerings for the temple of God in Jerusalem. Now, that might sound pretty incredible to you, but actually this was kind of Cyrus' modus operandi. If you'll recall me mentioning back in past weeks when the Assyrians carried the kingdom of Israel off into captivity, the Assyrians would strip a population out of the country and say, move all the Israelis here, move all the Hebrews here, move the Moabites over here, and they would transplant people to lands that weren't native to them. That kept them subjugated, and they did not allow them to worship their gods. Cyrus did just the opposite thing. He felt that the people would be better subjects if he not only allowed but encouraged them to worship their own gods. So, lest you think that Cyrus was a God-fearer, he was not. He was a pagan king just like the kings before him. He had a respect for God, and I think he knew that God had moved him, that God had called him to build this temple. But the Jews weren't the only ones whom he allowed to worship freely their own gods. But he did take another step and do something that was rather unusual. He had this large population of Jews who were in his area, and he said, I'm not only going to let you return, I'm going to send you back and give you help in restoring your temple, which he knew was of great importance to them. Not only did he say he was going to let them go, and he's going to give them help, he called on the neighboring peoples, when they go, see them off with money, give them gifts. Give them things, free will offerings to take with them. So not only did he free them, but he gave them help to rebuild the temple and provided money for them. Then in verse 5, then the family heads of Judah and Benjamin and the priests and Levites, everyone whose heart God had moved, prepared to go up and move the house of the Lord to Jerusalem. Now, did all the Jews return home? Absolutely not. It was actually a relatively small portion of the nation that had been taken away. Many had intermarried, found homes there, and wanted to stay. But we do know that at least from Judah and Benjamin, that tribes purposed to go back and rebuild the house of the Lord, which is what? The temple, which had been knocked to the ground by the Babylonians when they conquered Jerusalem in 586 BC. Moreover, King Cyrus brought out the articles belonging to the temple of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and placed in the temple of his God. Cyrus, king of Persia, had brought them by Mithredath, the treasurer, who counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. So here's what happened that was really incredible. When the Babylonians sacked the temple, Nebuchadnezzar, there was still some gold there. Some of it had been paid in tribute. So there were many, many fine articles that were still in the treasury of the king of Persia. And when he sent them back, he did an unheard of thing. He gave them these articles that had previously been in the temple. And what follows from verse 9 is an inventory, is a complete inventory of what they took. Now in chapter 2, they did something else very interesting, and I won't read it for you. In your spare time, you might want to look at it, but they wanted to give a list of the people who returned. So they even listed descendants by family of people who had been in captivity and returned. And that's what you'll find in chapter 2. But I'm going to take it up at the end of chapter 2 in verse 64, because I think this is important that you know. Of all the people that he listed, it said the whole company numbered 42,360, besides their 7,337, now talk about getting exact, 7,337 men servants and maid servants. They had 200 men and women singers, 736 horses, 245 mules, 430, which is 244 too many, by the way, 435 camels, and 6,720 donkeys, which is 6,720 too many. But they took away not only treasure, free will offerings, but they had their servants with them, and they also had livestock with them. When they arrived at the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, I'm in verse 68 now, some of the heads of the families gave free will offerings toward the rebuilding of the house of God on its site. According to their ability, they gave the treasury for this work 61,000 drachmas of gold, 5,000 minas of silver, and 100 priestly garments. The priests, Levites, singers, gatekeepers, and temple servants settled in their own towns along with some of the other people, and the rest of the Israelites settled in their own towns. So what happened? They came back to the area around Jerusalem, and what was there to greet them? A slab. Nothing. Literally, the temple was pretty much gone. What we find also is that the temple, the rubble from the temple, had literally been carried away to pave the roads of the Persians. So there was nothing there other than the foundations of the temple when they got there. What we find is that the families who settled there gave offerings. So there was the first Together We Build program. Right there. They gave offerings to help build the new building, and they settled in towns. Now in chapter 3, we encounter a controversy because it says when the 7th month came. That doesn't mean 7 months after they arrived. It's talking about the Hebrew month of Tishri, Tishri. That's the 7th month. Here's what we don't know. Was it right after they arrived? Was it indeed just a few months after they arrived? Or did it happen sometime later? Scholars are split. If you choose the former and say they got there and got to work, you've got problems with the timeline later. More than likely, they were there in their homes, getting their homes put together, getting established for probably up to 20 years. So they moved to the new land, to their ancestral home. They settled in. When the 7th month came, they had settled into their towns. The people assembled as one man in Jerusalem. Then Yeshua, which by the way is the same word as Joshua, which by the way is the same word as Jesus. It's all the same Jewish name, Yeshua, son of Josadak, and his fellow priest, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his associates began to build an altar of the God of Israel to sacrifice burnt offerings on it. Did they have a temple? What was the most important thing to them? Worship. What did they have to have for worship? In their time, the altar. I want to tell you something really neat that happened, well, more than 20 years ago, I guess. We were at a church in Bedford, Texas, Woodland Heights Baptist Church. The place was crowded, packed. We were meeting in a tiny little room that had actually served as the dressing room for the baptistry. That's how tiny our Sunday school classroom was. And we were building a new education building, and we had the slab poured, and they had come out with the blue line to snap a blue line down to tell them where to put the walls. And the next Sunday, I gathered my class together, and I said, the weather's pretty, everybody take your chair. This space inside this blue line is our Sunday school class. And they were so excited to go out there that we moved our entire Sunday school class, all, I don't know, Karen, 10 or 12 of us, out and set our chairs out on the slab and had our Sunday school lesson there, the first Sunday school lesson in a new educational building. They did the same thing here. They just had a slab, just had an open area, so they constructed an altar and they burnt offerings on it in accordance with what is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Now I'm in chapter 3, verse 3. Despite their fear of the peoples around them, they built the altar on its foundation and sacrificed burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both morning and evening sacrifices. Then, in accordance with what is written, they celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles with the required number of burnt offerings prescribed for each day. They presented regular burnt offerings, the new moon sacrifices, and the sacrifices for the appointed sacred feasts of the Lord. Let's go to verse 6. On the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, though the foundation of the Lord's temple had not yet been built. So what they did is they went back. Gentlemen, this is a football. They had been carried away into captivity. They had been exposed and subjected to pagan gods. When they left, they weren't exactly God-fearers, and that's why the Lord allowed the city to be sacked to begin with. So what was fascinating to me is that when Cyrus not let them go, but commanded them to return and rebuild the temple, the faithful few, 43,000 and change, went with the intent of returning to basics. We're going to go back and worship the way the Lord had commanded us to worship. Verse 7, they gave money to the masons and carpenters, gave food and drink and oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre so that they could bring cedar logs by sea from Lebanon to Joppa, as authorized by Cyrus, king of Persia. In the 2nd month of the 2nd year after their arrival, the house of God in Jerusalem, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Yeshua, son of Josadak, and the rest of their brothers, the priests and the Levites, all who had returned from captivity, began the work, appointing Levites 20 years of age and older to supervise the building. So what they did is they got their money, they got the raw materials in place, still with the help of Cyrus, who was encouraging them to build the temple. And this is, by the way, what was to be known as Zerubbabel's temple. That's the name that was kind of attached to it. It was a poor copy, based on the same foundation, but a poor copy of Solomon's temple, which, by the way, had fallen into disrepair. Remember, they actually stripped the mahogany and the cedar off the walls. They stripped the gold off the doors. So what was there was pretty shabby. Then it was knocked down to the bare foundation. So what was rebuilt was really nothing like the original temple, but it was a temple so that they could worship. An interesting thing started to happen. Going into verse 4. The people around them, the people who had been repatriated from other parts of the Assyrian Empire, some of them, by the way, would have been the Samaritans. The peoples who were placed there came to them and said, "Hey, you building a temple to God? Let us help." We don't understand what their motives are, but we do know this. They worshiped God. They worshiped Yahweh God. But He was only one of a pantheon of gods. He was only one of many gods. And they figured it wouldn't hurt to worship Jupiter and to worship Zeus and to worship this Yahweh God, because they worshiped a number of gods. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the families and said, "Let us help you build, because like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing to Him since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." Well, what do you think the Jews did? They said, "Man, this is a lot of work. We appreciate the help. Let's have a barn raising." No, these were pagan people. They didn't want them to have any part of erecting a temple for God. So look what they did. Zerubbabel, Yeshua, and the rest of the heads of the families of Israel answered, "You have no part with us in building a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us." Well, what do you think the reaction was from the neighbors? Yeah, they said, "Oh, you got to be kidding me. You can't do that to us. We've been thrown out of better places than this. Not only will we not help you then, we're going to throw any roadblocks in your way that we can." Verse 4, the peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building. They hired counselors to work against them and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of King Cyrus of Persia and down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. By the way, the Hebrew name is Daryavesh, which we'll call Darius instead of Daryavesh. And I want to kind of put a stick in the ground once again on the timeline of history in verse 6. At the beginning of the reign of Xerxes, they lodged an accusation against the people of Judah and Jerusalem. You remember Xerxes, anybody? Okay, he was the king during the time of Esther that we just studied. So let's put it in perspective once again. The people are all upset because they've been rejected. So they've caused them all the problems on the work site they can. Well, who was supporting them? The king of Persia. So they said, you know what? Let's go to the king of Persia and cause some trouble for him there, since he's their patron, since he's the one who's helping them. So they lodged a complaint. Now, I want to ask you to turn to verse 11 of chapter 4. And there's a copy of the letter they sent to Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes. From your servants, the men of Trans-Euphrates. By the way, the Persian Empire was divided up into satrapies, counties, if you will, because they had governors of each one, and there was one area called the area of the Trans-Euphrates. That was the area that Jerusalem was in the Persian Empire. The king should know that the Jews who came up to us from you have gone to Jerusalem and are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are restoring the walls and repairing the foundations. Now, how are they trying to set the stage here? This is not going to be flattering. How did they describe the city? King Artaxerxes, I want to remind you that when this city was up and operating, it was in rebellion all the time. It's a wicked city. It's rebellious. And they're restoring the walls right now. Furthermore, the king should know that if this city is built and its walls are restored, no more taxes, tribute, or duty will be paid, and the royal revenues will suffer. Didn't they know how to talk to a politician? Woo-hoo! The taxes are going to dry up. They're going to use their money, and they're going to rebuild this city. And let me tell you who they give their money to: Yahweh God, and not to the king of Persia. So you just need to know, if they get this thing done, that it's going to give you a hit in the pocketbook. So they went on to tell about all the problems that would be occurring because of the rebuilding of Jerusalem. But look at verse 17. The king sent a reply. And let me just kind of summarize it for you, because we need to move along. The king says, well, you're right. We can't have them taking money that belongs in my treasury to rebuild the city, so I'm going to issue a moratorium. So he said, stop working. Hint, they didn't. But he said, stop working, and that should settle it. In chapter 5, you're starting to see now a couple of names that you might recognize. Now, Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet, a descendants of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of God of Israel, who was over them. So here we've got two of the prophets that have returned with them, or prophesying at that time. Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, sons of Jodak, set to work to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, helping them. Now, let me summarize to you the rest of chapter 5. Haggai, Zechariah, Yeshua, and Zerubbabel, the four people who were pretty much in charge of the rebuilding of the temple, sent a letter to King Darius, Daryavesh. Sent a letter to him, and they said, look, I know that you've heard from these people around us that we're going to be rebellious people, but you ought to know that one of your ancestors, likely your grandfather, had sent out an edict that we have every right to rebuild this. As a matter of fact, he encouraged us to do that. Here's extra credit now. Does anybody remember in the story of Esther why Xerxes couldn't change his proclamation? Why he didn't change his proclamation? It was sealed with the royal seal, and he couldn't change it. So if indeed Cyrus had made a proclamation that they were to rebuild this temple, even his grandson Artaxerxes couldn't overrule him. So they were pretty smart, and they sent a letter to his father Darius, and they said, look, you might check into this. I think maybe we have every right to be here. We are the servants of God of heaven and earth. We're rebuilding the temple. Now look down at verse 17 of chapter 5. If it pleases the king, let a search be made in the royal archives of Babylon to see if King Cyrus did in fact issue a decree to rebuild this house of God. Then let the king send us his decision. So they said, we're not telling you what to do, just look in the archives. See what it says. So in chapter 6, Darius issued an order, and he searched the archives, and look what he found. And I don't know about your Bible, but mine in verse at the end of verse 2 says memorandum. I haven't heard that in 100 years. Memorandum. Actually, in the best Hebrew translation, that's what it says. It just says, you might take a note. In the first year of King Cyrus, the king issued a decree concerning the temple of God in Jerusalem. Let the temple be rebuilt as a place to present sacrifices. Let its foundations be laid. And then he goes and tells all about returning the gold that Nebuchadnezzar stole. And so he says, okay, You're right. I found the decree from my father. Now then, let Tattenai, the governor of the Trans-Euphrates, stay away from there. Here's what he's saying. All my governors, my government officials, don't bother these people. Cyrus said it was okay. He gave him the money to do it. Let him do it. Now, he really ups the price here. Look what he says in verse 8. Moreover, I hereby decree that whatever you do for these elders of the Jews in the construction of this temple of God, first, the expenses of these men are to be fully paid out of the royal treasury. Whoa! Not only are they to be allowed to build, but we're going to help pay for it. From the revenues of the Trans-Euphrates, so that the work will not stop. Whatever is needed, young bulls, rams, male lambs for burnt offerings, wheat, salt, wine, and oil, as requested by the priests, must be given to them daily without fail. In other words, what they need for their religious observances, you provide for them, Governor, so that they may offer sacrifices pleasing to the God of heaven and pray for the well-being of the king and his sons. Now listen to this. Furthermore, I decree that if anyone changes this edict, a beam is to be pulled from his house, and he is to be lifted up and impaled on it. That's not a $500 fine, folks. We're going to knock down your house, strip a 2x4 out of that, and stick you on it. He was serious about this. For this crime, his house to be made a pile of rubble. May God, who has caused his name to dwell there, overthrow any king or people who lifts a hand to change this decree or destroy this temple. I, Darius, have decreed it. Let it be carried out with diligence. So with the new help and with the encouragement of Darius, they completed the temple. Look down at verse 15. The temple was completed on the 3rd day of the month Adar, in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. As you can see, I get all kind of excited about this history because it tells us where the temple was, where it's been. Did you listen to what Jordan said today about a preacher and his job? He said, my first job is to share the word with you. What's the second thing you're supposed to do? So what? He got that from me, by the way. Now, I've always said that my job is to tell you what the Word says, what it means, and then what it means to me. So what? And so it may be enough that you're just excited about the history, to put it in perspective, say, how did the temple get rebuilt? By the way, the temple of Zerubbabel, only a poor copy of Solomon's temple, was later torn down to be replaced by Herod's temple, which is the temple in which Jesus ministered and worshiped. So, but this was the temporary temple for the time being, restored under the unlikely auspices of a pagan king. What does that mean to me? How possibly do we place this in our own perspective of 21st century America? And I caught Jordan down here on the front row after the service and said, man, you taught my Sunday school lesson for me today. Because after chastising his people, God took them back to the basics, and they worshiped Him the way He desired. I want you to stop and think about that. God told them that you're going to be my people forever and ever as long as you obey my commands. And what happened when they wandered away from Him? He warned them. He warned them time and time again. Remember the time of the judges? When it said, it almost got boring to hear it repeated time and time again. The people did each man did what was right in his own mind. They wandered away from God. They worshiped the pagan gods, and God allowed pagan people to come in and dominate them. And then when they returned their faces back to God, He raised up a judge to free them. Well, finally, God said, I've had enough of this. It's not the first time. You remember the first time? It started with rain. Remember when God said, I've had it with you people. I'm going to wipe the earth of you and save just a remnant. He's done it many times before. So in this time, He told them, you know what? You're going to keep messing around and turning to the Ashtaroths and the Baals, to the foreign gods, and I'm going to allow a foreign people to come in and take you away so that I'm going to preserve a remnant, because He promised that. And from that remnant, I'm going to go back to basics. So God had His gentlemen, this is a football speech. And as long as they blocked and tackled and took care of the basics, God was on their side. What possible application does that have for us? I hope there's some introspection going on here today. I mean, I really do. If nothing else, if Jordan's message didn't start it, look at it from this. You can take this very same principle and apply it to Crestview Baptist Church, to any church, or you can apply it to your own life. The staff is going to meet in just a couple of weeks. We have a day of retreat set aside that we're going to stop, that we do right around the last several years we've gotten together, and we've said, where are we getting comfortable? I don't rock your world, and I know this is a Baptist church, but when you start getting comfortable, very often you get stale. And your worship drifts. Do you remember me telling you several weeks back about a song that was one of my very favorites by Matt Redman? He says, I'm coming back to the heart of worship. And his pastor realized that they'd completely drifted away from their focus, which is worshiping the Lord, and they were starting to worship the band. So we went to the music minister, Matt Redman, this is over in Britain, and he says, you know what? No band. No music. We're unplugging. They had no music for a while, and then when they had music, they said, Matt, it's you and the guitar, or you and the piano. And gradually they added the instruments as they understood what was the focus. And in the words to the song, Redmond says, you know, I'm coming back to the heart of worship because it's all about you. And it's not about the band. Is there a danger of us doing that same thing? Yeah, there certainly is. Both in our corporate life and in our personal lives. And if you're in a routine, dare I even call it a rut, then let me tell you, you're there. You're stale and your worship has become stale. I'm amazed at the things people in church today worship. I've seen people worship the pastor. I've seen people worship the music. I've been in places where they worship the building. I don't know if you've ever been there. Worship the building. What's the problem? Church in the building. We're the church. This is just a tool for ministry. Where should our focus be? I like it just like an old country preacher from Bangs, Texas says, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And it's a good and helpful exercise regularly to examine what you're doing. And like Jordan says, it's okay to enjoy the fellowship and the warmth and the goodness. I love to be here with you because you're my kind of folks. I love you. But you know what? I got to figure most of you are saved. And I just can't help but notice a lot of them aren't here. And you heard me ask today for prayers for Southwestern University. I'm serious. I'm talking about, we were so narrow in our first scope, we were praying for the student lunch. Oh, how we missed that. We began to pray, we just prayed for the student lunch and God opened doors all over the campus. So we said, we're shorting God, and we started prayer walking, actually walking the campus of Southwestern University. Ed Ruby's been so faithful about doing that. Let's prayer walk the campus. And you know what started happening then? People on the campus couldn't help but notice and stopped and asked our people, why are you here? Now we've got relationships building now with professors, with coaches. And now we've got a booster club. If you haven't seen the Pirate Booster Club, an opportunity for us to get on campus, which we haven't been able to do in the past. We've been invited on campus, can you imagine? To develop a relationship with these sports teams. And here's what we're doing. We're loving a campus. And we're loving these kids. I'm here to tell you the vast majority of the people on that campus are lost as a goose. I'm telling you, they're lost. We got Christian clubs where I wouldn't give you a nickel that there was a Christian in the whole club. And this is giving us an opportunity through relations. The relationships that have developed have been incredible. We're even adopting a pirate where where certain families in our church are actually being assigned to a student who was asked, by the way. Can you imagine 30 students signed up and asked to be assigned to a Baptist family? Man, apparently they got over their fear of Baptist cooties. But you know what they desire? They're hungry for a relationship. And so last semester we averaged 70 kids on Monday walking in here to have lunch with us and get to know us. We're praying for 100 or more. And opportunities to touch lives on a campus that we haven't been able to reach. That's getting out of your comfort zone, and that's going back. That's, gentlemen, this is a football. How did Jesus begin his ministry? Relationships. He went to where they were and became one of them. So if it means wearing a black and gold t-shirt and becoming a pirate, that's what we're going to do. Pray for that next year, if you will. We're going to start in chapter 7 for next week's lesson. Read ahead. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for the lessons that we can learn of events, Father, that were 2,500 years ago. Father, how they apply today in such a very real way, both in our corporate lives and in our personal lives. And Father, we want to pray that you will help us to be uncomfortable, that we'll not bunker down, that we would not, Father, hole up in one place and just love one another, but follow your example and love the world around us. I thank you for these who come to study your lesson, and ask as usual, Father, that it blossom in their lives. Bless us as we go out of this place today, because we are always people sharing Jesus, and we do it in your name. Amen. Please find someone you don't know and say hello to them.